thank you again for being here and supporting this event. I'll just do a little brief intro for Chuck. I have been following Chuck's podcast, Strong Towns, for a number of years. I get a lot of value out of those podcasts and the blog posts. As an academic, as a professor, I have used Chuck's work in my college classes because they often provide real-world case studies for larger, theoretical problems that we deal with in political science. As a representative policymaker, especially in my time in Holyoke, I had often used the Strong Towns podcast to, figure out how other people are thinking and talking about different problems and see what makes sense locally, especially when you have to digest big, complex, municipal issues into small, easy to understand bites for public consumption. I think that the podcast does a really great job of turning those complex issues into smaller things that we could build conversations around. And then finally, I think it's really funny. I want to share this story.
Please. I was going to if you did.
So I'm a year in this role, and when I was first tasked with the work of supporting the Center Downtown District planning, I filled out a form on the Strong Towns website, and I never expected to hear back, but I heard back, and that was really exciting. And then a few months later, I was in Disneyland, California with my family, online for a ride, and I'm moving in one direction, and Chuck and one of his board members is walking in the other direction. He's like, we need to get you into East Long Meadow. You have so much to say. And it took a while, but here we are, a year later, and welcome, Chuck Marohn, everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we do have a very interesting culture at Strong Towns. We were online before, remote before everybody else was remote. So I started writing a blog in 2008 and started expanding our team in 2013, 2014, and everybody worked remote. We've always been, from day one, remote. And part of having a remote culture, if you're gonna work together as a team, you need to get together and get to know each other. So a couple times a year, we will have retreats where we bring everybody to a place. That was logistically kind of easy when it was 3-4 of us. There's 22 of us now. The first week of December, we will be going to Orlando and staying at Disney Springs. And my wife's like, you just go have fun. And I'm like, yeah, but we do work. We have a couple days of work that we do, and then we spend a day at a theme park. And we used to, I think as we've grown, it's gotten less formal, but I love to have our meetings at theme parks. The lines become a feature, not a flaw, right? So you actually have, I will go to the park, have like 3 or 4 people with me. It was just Norm that day when you and I was working out some things with Norm. But we'll go and I'll have a list of 10, 15 things I want to talk through. And we'll get in the longest line there and just talk. And while you're waiting in line, you're kind of jawing and chatting. And then, you know how like in those meetings, you're like, oh, I wish this meeting was over. Why is it still going on? And then, when you're in line, the line ends. And like if the meeting should be over, you just go on to the next topic. If it shouldn't be over, it comes back up. It is a really efficient way to run a meeting. And so we've done it that way for, 10 years now. The trick is I do my board meetings this way too. We spend a day in a conference room and then a day at a theme park. And my board, they play along, they're really fun. But we have one board member who said, I will know we have succeeded as a movement. I will know we have grown this thing big enough and influential enough when we are at Disney World and someone comes up and says, hey, are you Chuck Marohn? Are you guys with Strong Towns? If that happens, he said, I'm done. I'm off the board. And so when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh. The first thing was like, because I need Ian. He's so important to our organization. So when I ran it, you're like, are you Chuck Marohn? I'm like, yeah. But it was very delightful. I got to meet your family, and we had a really nice time, and it was very special. So Thank you all for being here tonight. I know it did take a while to make this happen. I was in town today to speak to a group of planners in downtown Springfield. That was a really exciting, high-energy event. We've got scheduled this tonight and another one tomorrow morning, an encore before I head back. Last week I was not on the road, but I've been on the road 11 weeks prior to that with this book tour, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts about housing. We're going to go through that tonight, but when we get done, I'd love to talk about whatever you want to talk about. This is the third book in a 5-book series about building cities and how we make cities strong and productive and resilient. I'm a civil engineer. I'm a land use planner. Our organization is a bottom-up movement for changing the way we talk about growth, development, public investment, how we make our cities stronger, more prosperous, and more resilient, particularly when we struggle financially to do that. So let's get started. There's a conversation in this country about housing that begins with the idea of, are we in a housing crisis? And I know you may have heard we just had an election. There's a lot of things that we don't necessarily agree on in this country, but one of the things we tend to agree on is that, yes, there is a housing crisis. But when we ask people, what needs to happen to housing prices in order to address this housing crisis, we get an interesting mix of answers. About half the people say prices need to go up, and the other half say prices need to go down. If you are in one of these categories, you're probably wondering, who are these insane people in the other category, right? Obviously, housing prices are too expensive. In order to alleviate the housing crisis, prices need to go down. Obviously, housing prices are central to our economy. They're central to our life savings, our investments. They're central to bank reserves, mortgage-backed securities. If prices go down, this is going to be a disaster. We have two separate conversations going on about housing today. One is centered around housing as shelter. Everyone needs a place to live. This is like the base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need food, we need shelter. When housing is too expensive, when you can't find shelter, when you have to stretch financially to get into shelter, it strains everything about your life. The other conversation about housing is housing as a financial product. Housing not only as the biggest savings vehicle for most families, but also as something that, as a financial derivative, now sits as the reserves of every banking institution in the country. These two different views of housing lead to wildly different narratives. In one of these narratives, housing prices must fall. In order for people to get into housing, in order for people to be able to afford housing, in order for them to be able to live decent lives, housing prices need to fall and fall dramatically. And this is true not just for poorer people. Everybody now, through the whole spectrum, middle class, upper middle class, professionals, we are all stretched getting into new houses. Housing prices must fall. In the other conversation, housing prices cannot be allowed to fall. If housing prices go down, even if they flatline for an extended period of time, we will experience dramatic fiscal stress. This is the essence of the housing trap. The trap that we have created for ourselves around housing, where housing cannot go up without hurting people, housing prices cannot go down without dramatically destroying and having dramatic impacts on the economy. This is the trap we find ourselves in. I want to take some time tonight to talk about how we got into this trap, and then I want to talk about what we can do to get out of it. And I want to put the emphasis at the top on what we can do. Strong Towns as an organization, as a movement, is all about bottom-up change. We recognize that presidents will come and go, Fed chair will come and go, Congresses will come and go, policies will change, policies will shift. We can't we can't defer to others to solve our problems. We have to actually address these things ourselves to the extent that we can. The number one bit of sentiment I get as I've traveled around the country this year talking to people about housing is a sense of helplessness. Local officials, in particular, feel helpless to address this problem. It's a federal problem. It's an inflation problem. It's a Federal Reserve problem. It's got to be solved by Wall Street. It's got to be solved by others. I want us to leave tonight without that feeling of helplessness. I want us to leave tonight with a sense that we understand what's going on and we can actually do something about it. So if we go back before the Great Depression and we look at how housing was financed, if you were going to buy a house before the Great Depression, that was going to be a very local transaction. If you were going to get a loan for that house, go to a bank, it would have been a local bank. And understand what the local bank at that point would have been. There was no FDIC insurance. There was no backstop. You were trusting your money to a local institution. And that local institution was going to lend that money out to someone else. They were literally going to take all of your money and lend it to you, or all of your money and lend it to you. That's how this worked in a community, right? Because of this, local banking was a hyper-conservative undertaking, very, very risk-averse. If we're going to make a loan with all of your savings, that loan can't lose money. So if you were going to buy a house, you were going to have 50% down payment. That mortgage was going to be a 3, 4, or 5-year mortgage where you would pay interest only, and at the end of it, there would be a balloon payment. The idea was when you get to the end, you would either pay it off, pay it down, or roll it over into a new loan. This allowed people to purchase homes, to access local financing, but to keep the bank, in a sense, solvent, because, again, very, very risk-averse with all of your savings. When we got into the Great Depression, when the country, we had the big Wall Street crash, the country entered this period of time we now know as the Great Depression, what happened to housing prices? Housing prices fell, right? They started to drop. And they just dropped because economically, we had 25% unemployment, we had huge economic dislocation. People could not afford to buy houses. They had less capacity during the Depression than before. And so prices started to fall. I want to walk you through what happens with these very, very local financial products when prices fall. If we have a home that we bought before the Great Depression, and we borrowed 50% of the cost, and then the home drops in value, when our 3-year, 4-year, 5-year interest-only loan comes due, and we have to roll that over into a new loan, what we find is that the bank is now willing to lend us less money than they were before. Our house is worth less. 50% of that less is less than what we owe. And what we find is that there is a difference between what you owe and what the bank will lend you. The bank would then say to you, hey, for us to do this loan, we need you to come up with cash for the difference. Cash in the middle of the Great Depression. A lot of people couldn't do this. And when they couldn't do this, what does the bank do with your loan? They foreclose on your house, right? Like they take your property. They've got 50% equity. They can sell it at quite a loss in order to make their money back. They are, again, all of your savings are in this bank. You're counting on this bank not to go away, not to screw this up. And so they're going to be very risk adverse. They're going to take your house and they're going to sell it into the market. What happens when a bank in a declining housing market starts to foreclose on homes and sell them into that market? What happens to housing prices? They fall even further. And then the next person who comes in has an even bigger gap. They get foreclosed on, their house gets sold off, prices fall further. The next person has a bigger gap, and on and on and on. This is what economists call a deflationary spiral. And as we were sitting in the early years of the Great Depression, what we saw was this deflationary spiral in home prices. The more prices went down, the more people were caught in this financing trap. The more people were caught in this financing trap, the more homes got foreclosed. The more homes that were foreclosed on, the more were sold onto the market at fire sale prices. The more prices went down and on and on and on. At the beginning of the FDR administration, the first thing that they worked to do was to stop this decline. And they did this in ways that would be very familiar to us today. The Roosevelt administration went to local banks, and one of the first things they said was, hey, stop foreclosing on people. If you have a loan that is non-performing or you can't roll over, we, the federal government, will buy that loan from you. Don't foreclose on people. The federal government bought millions of dollars of loans from banks. Just gave the bank the money they were owed, we'll take that loan. They then went to the property owners and they said, hey, how about we refinance that loan for you and you pay us, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the federal corporation we set up, you pay us and we'll finance that for you over 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. Instead of paying interest only, how about you pay interest and principal, so you pay that off over time. We then went to local banks and we said, hey, not only do we want you not to foreclose, we would actually like it if you would write more loans. We need people buying homes. We need people staying in their homes. Why don't you write more loans? And when you do, instead of asking for 50% down payment, why don't you ask for 40% or 30%? And we know that creates more risk for you, so the federal government will step in and provide mortgage insurance. We will actually insure you against loss. So if you do experience a loss, the federal government will make you whole. Mortgage insurance. Ultimately, the federal government said, hey, we want you to write a lot of loans, and instead of making them 3, 4, 5 year, we would like you to make them 12-year or 15-year or 20-year loans. And we will actually set up a secondary market. We'll create this institution called Fannie Mae, and Fannie Mae will buy those loans from you if you ever want to unload them. As long as they meet certain requirements, if you need to, in a sense, boost up your reserves, be able to, unload some things in your portfolio to increase your cash, the federal government will buy those loans from you. So go ahead and make those longer term loans, the loans that are more risky for you that you don't want to do. This mix of things, I'm not going to say solved the housing problem, but what they did is they stopped that deflationary spiral. They stopped the rapid fall of home prices. They kept people in their homes. And I use this word in the book, and I'm going to use it here today. I feel like there is a real moral dimension to this that is important to emphasize. The dignity of keeping people in their homes, people who were losing their homes through no fault of their own, nothing they had done, just the overall economic conditions turning against them. This allowed people the dignity of staying in their places. It stabilized the market. It allowed people to stay in their homes. At the end of World War II, the economists around the president started to freak out. Let's say this first. We're all taught in middle school that the thing that got us out of the Great Depression was World War II, right? I think it's important to note how insane that is. Our culture is dominated by the language and thinking of economists. Only economists would say, oh, we have really hard times, things are really bad, and they'll, oh yeah, awesome, global war. This really makes everything work again. The language that we use, the way we talk about this, is really distorted by the language of economists, which is not the way humans think of this, right? Global war with tens of millions of people dead, this is a tragedy. If you are a bean counter who looks at GDP statistics, World War II, awesome, happy times are here again because the number's going up. Okay? At the end of World War II, as the war was coming to an end, the economists around the president started to freak out. This is a quote from Paul Samuelson, who's one of the senior economists for the Roosevelt administration, actually probably our most famous economist here in the United States, particularly of the last century. He said, were the war to end suddenly, there'd be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation any economy has ever faced. If this war ends and we bring home all these troops, we shut down all these industries of war, there's nothing different about our economy in 1945 as there was in 1935. And we're just going to slide right back into the depths of depression. Is that what happened? Of course not, right? We did something completely different. We took all of that capacity that we had and we put it towards building a new version of America. We took all of that industrial might, all of that wealth that we had acquired from the rest of the world and selling them, ships and planes and munitions and everything else. We took all of those young people coming back from war with all the kind of go-get-em enthusiasm, and we said, let's build a different version of America, one that will create a huge middle class, one that will have kind of eternal prosperity, one where, and again, this is the language of economists, one where our economy can grow and grow and grow. Let's turn our cities into machines of growth, where all we got to do is add capital, and they will spit out growth after growth after growth. We built highways, we built sewer and water systems, we expanded cities rapidly, we financed commercial development, and from a residential standpoint, we took all of those tools that in the Great Depression allowed us to stop the downward decline, and we reworked them to make prices go up, to make the economy grow. We said things like, hey, 30% down payment sounds good. How about 20%? How about 10%? Could we do 5%? Could we do no down payment? Could we do down payment assistance? 20-year mortgage sounds great. How about a 30-year mortgage? That would be even better. How about, instead of 8% interest rates, how about we do 6% for GIs? How about we do 6% for GIs and their spouses? How about we do it for everybody? How about we do 4%? How about we do 3%? It was a constant battle, a constant effort to make it easier for people to borrow more money and ultimately to pay more for houses. This was a deliberate strategy to grow a middle class, to grow the economy, and to keep us out of the Great Depression. Let me be really clear. This was wildly successful. This is wildly successful. We still nostalgize today, those couple of decades after World War II, as this like golden age of America. In fact, did you know we just had an election? I feel like what's fascinating, this election was, to me, not as fascinating culturally as the 2016 election was. And I'm gonna make a statement. I know emotions are raw. You all seem very kind. I think you'll be generous to me. I'm not gonna make a partisan statement, but I know people sometimes hear nonpartisan statements in a partisan way. Please don't hear this in a partisan way. If we go back to the 2016 election, at that time, what you had two 70-ish-year-old candidates who were running on platforms to restore us to a level of greatness or a level of prosperity that they deemed as the best in American history. One of those visions was blue-collar jobs and Ozzie and Harriet families. And one of those visions was of a federal government that could be expansive and generous and do great things like build big infrastructure projects and expand the social safety net with Medicare and Social Security. Both of these candidates were talking about the 20 years of their youth, in a sense, the pinnacle of this kind of American expansion that happened at the end of World War II. They were both referring to the exact same period of time and how we can, in a sense, restore that. This worked really, really well. Now, for those of you, and I see a couple of you have my first book, recognize the trade-off that we make at the local government level when we grow in this way. Let me summarize that whole book in 30 seconds. When local governments go out and build the next subdivision, we can often get that financed by somebody else. The developer will pay for the road and the pipe. The county will pay for the major infrastructure. We can get a federal grant for the sewer system. We can get all this stuff built by other people. There's all kinds of programs that make this happen. When the transaction happens, we get all this new growth, all the permit fees, all the utility fees, all the property taxes, and all we have to do as a town, all we have to do as a city is say, hey, when this stuff falls apart, we'll fix it. That is a really great investment in year one. It's a really great investment in year two. In year 3, year 4, year 5, when everything's brand new, this is wonderful. But when you start to get out 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, what you see is that everything starts to go bad all at the same time. And without a mechanism to renew, without a way to make this work financially, and without the tax base sufficient to actually take care of this stuff, cities wind up raising taxes, they wind up taking on lots of debt, they wind up putting off critical maintenance, and they end up trying to grow even faster to get that next generation of easy cash. From a national economy, what we see is that when we pump money into this growth machine of cities, we get very, very fast returns. We can grow really quickly. And the federal government and the state government differ from local governments in that they're not taking on any liabilities. They don't have a road to maintain. They don't have a fire department to sustain. They don't have a pipe to repair. They don't have a fire hydrant, a water tower, like go through your litany of things that we assume as debt, that we assume as liabilities when we grow in this way. This is the Case-Shiller Housing Index. I apologize to all the people who don't like charts. There are not that many in this presentation, but I'm an engineer and I like charts. I'll walk you through this one. This one is a little geeky. The Case-Shiller Home Price Index goes back to 1890, and it shows housing prices over time relative to wages. So if you think about going through a period of time where wages go up, what happens to housing prices if everybody in the country's wages doubled next year, what would happen to housing prices? Housing prices would double, right? We just pay more. So the Case-Shiller Index tries to kind of even that out, right? So what you're looking at here is housing prices, and I've truncated it from the end of World War II. So I'm going to walk up here, and I'll talk a little bit louder. At the end of World War II, we had this period of time where GIs were coming back. We were figuring out this. We were putting up the things that would allow us to grow very quickly. You see some volatility, but then we have this long period of decline in housing prices. This is the kind of thing that economists would call added efficiency or productivity. The idea that your flat screen TV costs less today than it did 5 years ago. Why? Because supply chains have gotten better, manufacturing's gotten more efficient. That's what you're seeing in those first 2 decades after World War II. We're figuring out how to build housing at scale. We're doing it using these new 30-year mortgages, Fannie Mae. We're build. We got the GI Bill. We got all this stuff. It's very exciting. And we're figuring out how to do it more and more efficiently. But housing, and really the growth of our cities, is such a seductive way to kind of smooth over all of the wrinkles in our economy that we just pour more and more money into it. And what we see at the end of the 1960s is we start to experience a bout of inflation. You all are paying really close attention. I feel like I can go a little deep here and get a little geeky. Inflation is really, really bad when it comes to housing. And again, please don't, I know our recent election has had a lot of talk about inflation. Ignore that. Listen to what I'm talking to you about with local banks. If you are a local bank, your business model is pretty simple. There's actually a joke called the 363 rule. If you're a local bank, you practice 363. You borrow at 3%, you lend at 6%, and then you get out on the golf course by 3 p.m. It's actually a really boring, simple business. The idea is you borrow money as a bank, and who do you borrow from? Depositors, right? And then you lend out to people who want loans, and the spread, the interest rate spread, is how you make your money. You have to make good loans that don't default. That's part of the deal. But as long as you do that and you've got a spread, you will make money. It's kind of hard not to. Okay. There's a reason why banks, before the Great Depression, did short-term loans. And it really comes to bear at the end of the 1960s when we have our first bout of inflation. And I'll explain to you why. If you are a bank, and let's say depositors come into you and deposit their money, and I know this is going to be quaint to some of you younger people, but banks used to pay this stuff called interest on your deposits. The way it would work is you would deposit your money at the bank, and they might pay you 5% interest a year, right? The bank would then turn around and make a loan at 7%. That difference is their profit, okay? Now let's say the bank stops making short-term loans and start making long-term loans, 30-year mortgages, right? So now the bank is paying you 5%, they're collecting 7%, they're making money. But now we have a bout of inflation, and inflation goes to 8%. Okay, are you going to keep your money in the bank that's paying you 5% when you're essentially losing 8% in value every year on it? No, you're not going to. What are you going to do? You're going to say, hey, if I'm going to keep my money there, not take it out, do something else with it, if I'm going to keep it there, I need a higher rate of interest. You're going to demand, if inflation is 8%, you're going to demand 9%, 10%, 11% in interest. If the bank has a 30-year loan at 5%, and now all of a sudden they've got to pay you 8%, they are losing money every month. And because that is a long-term loan, they can't get out of that. The bank at that point has two choices. Choice number one, they get rid of that loan. If they get rid of that loan, they get rid of that loan at a loss. Who wants to buy a loan at 5% when you can originate a new one at 10%? Nobody, unless you give them a steep discount. So the bank can essentially lose a lot of money right now. Or they can slowly bleed to death every month, losing a little bit of money every month. If we go back to before the Great Depression, there was a limit to how much they would bleed, because it was 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, and then it would roll over. And when it rolled over, they would roll it over at the higher interest rate. There was an end to the bleeding. But if you have a 20-year, 30-year mortgage, the bleeding could go on for decades, way longer than you can stay solvent. So at a local bank, you've got two choices. We either leave our interest rates low and lose all our depositors and our bank fails, or we raise our interest rates and we slowly bleed to death. This is untenable. And so when inflation goes up and interest rates go up, what you see is this pattern where housing prices, and I'm going to go to the one in the late 60s, early 70s, housing prices go up. Uh-oh. I've accidentally put my hand in front of the screen and I screwed it up. Will it turn back on? Okay, good. Sorry. Housing prices go up. If you look at that rise, in respect to where we are today, it doesn't look very big. But if you think about where they were back then, prices had been going like this, and then all of a sudden they go really high. The federal government stepped in. They did a number of things to bail out local banks. Because what they had said to the banks in the Great Depression is, hey, if you make these loans that don't make sense for you, we have your back. We will take care of you if this goes bad. The federal government created an organization called Freddie Mac. They created another organization called Ginnie Mae. These organizations were designed to purchase these loans from local banks. Let's get those loans off your books. You don't want to have them. They're low interest rate. Essentially, the government stepped in and said, we will take that loss for you. We want you to keep issuing loans, issue new loans at higher rates, but those bad ones, those stinky ones, those ones you don't want, we will take those for you. We will, as a federal government, take that loss. Interest rates went up and housing prices came back down. We had a repeat of this episode in the mid to late 70s. High levels of inflation. We've heard talk about, the Volcker interest rate rise and all that in the early 1980s. Interest rates went way, way up, and housing prices came back down. Again, another round of bank bailouts. In the early 1980s, the FDIC estimated that there was and these numbers are going to seem quaint at today's standards. Back then, they were astronomical. $130 billion insolvency in S&Ls across the country, savings and loans. They had $10 billion in the FDIC to, in a sense, pay off those deposits when the banks went bad. We couldn't actually afford a banking crisis. And so the goal in the early 1980s was to grow our way out of this mess. And so we not only turned our back on a lot of fraud, but we pumped a lot of money into banks, into housing to make it grow, grow, grow. That's the third little bump up there. You see each of these bumps is higher than the last one. Oh, by the way, I put my clicker down here. I should be doing this as we go. There's the first inflation bubble. The second one, this is the S&L bubble. This is the third bump up. After the S&L bubble, we're in the early 1990s, and the idea then was, okay, we created a lot of fraud. Now we need to not go that route again. Let's, instead of deregulate, let's decentralize. Let's make housing like even more local. Let's get credit scores. Let's get local banks writing lots of loans. Let's try to get people who are on the margins of the credit market into the game. And you ended up with the subprime bubble. The thing I want you to note about this is that every gyration, the peak gets higher, right? We come back down to like something that would equate to normalcy, and then the rise goes even higher. This is, in a sense, housing becoming more and more and more financialized as we go. During this transition in the early 1970s, we came up with securitization. Securitization is the idea that we'll take all of your mortgages, sell them off to a bundler. A bundler will put them together into one package and then sell parts of this package to many people as a security. That's securitization. This started with the most conservative loans in the early 1970s. By the time you get to the early 2000s, we're doing what we all have come to know as the subprime loans. Loans that were, let's say, a little bit fraudulent, right? Where the repayment schedule was not necessarily what it should have been. But the idea is we can make it a AA or AAA rated security by having geographic diversity. It should be noted that in the 1980s, during one of these bailouts, we actually went to banks and said, hey, if you own mortgage-backed securities that have a AA rating or higher, you can use those as your reserves. So instead of holding cash or treasury notes, which pay this much interest, you can own mortgage-backed securities, which pay this much interest. And if you've got money you just have to have sitting there, you might as well have it in mortgage-backed securities and make a little bit more on your reserves. This all created this insatiable demand for mortgages. We could not create mortgages fast enough. In fact, by the time you get to 2004, 2005, we are actually creating this thing called a synthetic mortgage, which is you've got a mortgage and you've got a mortgage and you've got a mortgage, and we bundled them all together. And then we create a thing that represents what is in that portfolio so that this thing can be bet upon, hypothecated, done all this stuff with it to gamble in the market. Mortgages in each of these instances became more and more and more central to the financial workings of the economy. What this means for us is that these are financial products. Secondarily, they are also shelter to us, right? People live in these places. You have single-family homes. People live in single-family homes. You've got 5/1 apartment buildings. People live in those, absolutely. But their primary purpose, their primary function in our economy today is as a financial product. Secondarily, they serve as housing. When people buy a home, we have this embedded assumption that we are the customer and the house is the product. But in terms of what actually drives the price of housing today, it's not what is the product, it's who is the product. When you buy a house, you are creating a product called a mortgage. That mortgage is in massive demand. It is, in a sense, a promise that part of your earnings for the next 3 decades will go to retiring a note. That promise can be bundled with other promises. It can be securitized and sold off to pension funds and investment funds and venture, not so much VC, but other hedge funds and other things as their reserves. It can be bet against. These things are tremendous financial products. And under the guise of adding more liquidity to the market, making it grow more, having it be a more liquid, more robust market, we have taken the core of human existence, the idea of shelter, and we have turned it into primarily a financial product. Where are we today? We're actually a little bit higher than that right now. This is when we wrote the book. That's the end of 2022. We've actually dipped down and then went higher. Again, we live in a world dominated by the language of economists. If you listen to economists, they will all universally call 2000 to 2008 the subprime bubble, the housing bubble, the subprime crisis. But if you listen to them, they will call what has happened subsequently a housing recovery. How do you recover to a bubble? How do you recover to a bubble condition? How do we restore ourselves to unsustainability? The idea that we can make it easier for more people to borrow more money, to pay more for housing, may have been the answer to our problems in the Great Depression. Maybe it was the answer to our problems at the end of World War II. It is no longer the answer to our problems. And if we go back and listen to candidates in the last election, and again, not a partisan statement, an observation, a big part of the housing program, wherever there was a program, always had to do with first-time homebuyer assistance, down payment assistance. How do we help people get cash to get more money to get into a house? None of this is about making housing more affordable. None of it is about lowering prices for people. All of it is about making it easier for you to pay more for a house. That is the trap. That is where we're stuck. And right now, the big product that's being talked about on Wall Street that we need to roll out is the 40-year mortgage. The idea is, just like we did with Greece when they couldn't pay their debts, and we said, all right, let's refinance them over 50 years or 80 years to get that payment down. Essentially a indebted country that just pays debt now. We want to do that to our families. If we can make that mortgage, used to be 5 years, then it was 8 years, and it was 12 years, and 15, and then 20, and then 30. If we can make it a 40-year mortgage, more people can afford to pay more for the same house. Pledge more of their future earnings. This is not the answer. This is not the answer. So what is the answer? What do we do differently? I want to go back to this idea that these are financial products. I realize that we all live in these financial products. To us, they are not. To us, they are home, right? They are shelter. But I think if we don't recognize their role as financial products in the market, we will shadow box this thing a long, long time. We have to actually recognize the role these fill in our economy. Because what it will do is it will show us where there is a gap that we can fill. This is just a normal bell curve. This is not scientific. I'm trying to make a narrative point here. So again, sorry about the chart. What I'm showing here is a distribution of capital. There is a lot of money, a gargantuan sum of money to build these financial products. If you are a home builder and you want to build single family homes, and you can go out and build 200 of them, 500 of them, 1,000 of them, there's an unlimited supply of money you can tap into. You will have no problem getting all the loans you need to make this happen. Tons of liquidity. There are so many people ready to invest in this stuff. All you got to do is say, like, I can credibly build it. Now, if you want to go build one home or two home, much, much harder. But if you are like a big company, if you are D.R. Horton, if you're Centex Homes, and you're going to go build 500 homes over here or 2,000 homes over here, unlimited capital. You have no problem financing that. If you are one of the companies, and there's really about 25 of them that build something like 80% of the 5/1s, apartment buildings in this country. If you are one of those companies, again, these are more expensive products to build, but unlimited amount of liquidity. You will have no problem getting the financing. If you can credibly build these, you can get the money to build them. There's tons of money in the market to build this stuff. These are great, great, great financial products. On the far wealthy end of this distribution, rich people, this will come as no surprise, have no problems financing their home construction. They just don't. It's easy for them to get the financing. If they're not paying cash, they can get the loans. They've got plenty of collateral. They've got plenty of money. They can build a house. There's no wealthy person who's like, I really can't build my dream house because I don't have the money. It's not how it works. Where there is no capital, where there is no money at all, is at the entry-level end of the spectrum. If you want to build an entry-level home, if you want to build a unit that would be in this very low price range, there is no capital for you to do that. There is no way to finance it. There's no easy way to construct it. There is no liquid market. It is really, really hard to find financing to do that kind of work. I want to talk about what those homes look like, because they look very simple to us. From a financial standpoint, they're really complicated or really unfundable in the current system, which again, the current system is a big now top-down financialized system. You've got to meet check boxes and fall into different categories to get this stuff securitized. This is a single-family home. This looks like any normal single-family home. I want you to think of one of these that is occupied by a single person, right? And let's be clear, more than 2/3 of our households in this country are 1- and 2-person households. No kids, nobody else, just 1- and 2-person households. 2 out of 3, more than 2/3 of our houses. More than 2/3 of the homes we've built are multi-person homes. Like they're single-family homes with multiple bedrooms. So we have a lot of people who are living in houses with multiple empty bedrooms all the time. Let's imagine one of them, someone living in a house. Let's think of this person and think of their financial situation as being on a fixed income, with property taxes going up, with inflation, with, money being tight. This is a person who is house rich and cash poor. Wouldn't it be incredible if they could take one of those 3 spare bedrooms they have, put in a kitchenette, put on an exterior door, and rent it out as an apartment? This is something that is really, really normal in any other part of the world and in any other time in history. Americans used to do this up until really the suburban experiment, up until zoning, building codes, financing, financialization. We did this all the time. In fact, if you were visiting the city of Springfield 100 years ago, and you were going to spend the night, you really had 3 options. One, you could stay at a really high-end, nice luxury hotel, and you had a few of those. They were spectacular, right? You could have stayed at a more seedy establishment, maybe a bar/brothel kind of place. There's a little few of those. But most likely, especially if you were middle class or working class people, you would have walked down the street, seen a house with a little sign on it that said, hey, room for rent. You would have shown up, given them a nickel or a dime or a quarter or whatever they were asking for. They would have shown you up to the spare room, In the morning, you would have got up, they would have given you breakfast in a bag and send you on your way. The original bed and breakfast, right? We think of bed and breakfast as like the quaint place you go in the countryside on your honeymoon weekend or special night out or whatever. This was just a very normal way to do things. People who had extra house and not enough cash would rent out a room. You want to do that today? I'm sorry, that's a duplex. We don't allow duplexes in the zoning district. You want to get financing to do that? Sorry, we can't do that. That's not allowed in our system. You want to do that? Sorry, the building code's going to require you to do 20 different things. All this stuff that is very, very simple, we make really, really complicated. This is a backyard cottage. Please, if you are a technical person, stop calling them ADUs. An accessory dwelling unit sounds like a disease that people catch. Again, I think we need to talk about these in terms that humans understand. We all recognize the desire to have, these are often called mother-in-law apartments. The idea that you may have someone in your family who needs some help and some support, who can move in, live in the backyard. Again, you're yard rich and cash poor. So let's let grandma come and live in the house in the backyard. And the funny thing is, if we go around and talk to people and say, that's what we're gonna do. My wife's mother is sick. She needs care. She wants her independence. We're gonna, instead of putting her in a home or some other place, we're gonna have her come and live with us. She's gonna live here, help out with the kids. We're all like, oh yeah, please do that. That's such a heartwarming, wonderful thing. But then if we say, oh, sorry, it's not her, it's the divorced guy who's gonna crash here for the next 2 months while he gets his life figured out. We're like, oh my God, where's he gonna park? How many people are gonna be coming to visit? What hours of the day will he be there? We have all this litany of things we freak out about, right? Again, this is the easiest form of housing to construct. It's the hardest form of housing to get permitted, to get financing for, to actually get built. This is a starter house. Again, don't call these tiny houses. It fetishizes something that is actually, again, very, very normal. How many of you would like to live in a 400, 500, 600 square foot house? A couple of you. How many of you in your life have lived in a 400, 500, 600 square foot place, right? We all have to some degree or another. When we don't allow this kind of construction, when we make it really, really hard, and again, you can't get financing for this stuff. If you went to a bank and said, I'm gonna build a 400 square foot house, I want a 30-year mortgage on it, they would laugh at you. They don't do that. If you wanna go build this kind of thing, in my city, we label this a tiny house. If you wanna go build this, you have to not only meet all the requirements of a house, you have to meet subpart A through M of the tiny house provisions. You've got to go ask permission from all your neighbors. You have to go genuflect to the planning board. You got to do all this stuff to prove that building a starter house is not going to create chaos and mayhem in your neighborhood. What is a starter house? This is literally like the building block of every neighborhood pre-Great Depression. We can go through the neighborhoods in your town that were here over 100 years ago, and you are going to see over and over and over again starter houses. Now, most of them don't look like starter houses anymore because they've been added on to, because that's what you do. You build what you can afford. When you save up a little bit of money, you put the addition on the back. When you have a kid, you put on the second story. The neighbor comes over and helps. You go help your neighbor. This is how we built houses around the world for thousands and thousands of years. We have made this almost impossible to do from a regulatory standpoint, and we made it almost impossible to do from a financing standpoint. There is no good reason why we've taken this unit off the market. So, at Strong Towns, we talk about 3 things that we need to do to get out of this housing trap. And let me be clear what I mean by we. We have I feel like we have a common sense, common understanding of what local government is, but it's an understanding that holds up in a meeting like this and then goes away when we dissipate. So let me say it clearly so that we all hang on to it. We see local government as the highest level of collaboration for people working together in a place. We reject the idea that local government is the lowest level of government in a food chain of governments. We often think of local government as like the algae of government, right? Like you have the federal government, you have the state government, you have regional government, and then you have lowly local government. And they get, all the directives, all this. No, local government is the way we work together. We work together on our blocks, we work together in our neighborhoods, and when we collaborate, we come together, and local government is the highest form of us collaborating together. So when I say we, what I'm talking about, particularly in the housing book, is that there are ways for us to work together, empowering local government to do things that can actually solve this problem for us, that can actually change our local housing market and make the housing here more responsive to our needs. 3 things that we need to do. The first is we need regulatory reform. We actually need to change how we permit and approve these units. Second, we need an ecosystem of incremental developers, people who are actually going to go out and build this stuff competitively in a marketplace. And then 3, we need localized financing. We need local government to actually step in and use tools they have to fill this financing gap and fund the construction of those entry-level units that no one else is willing to fund. Let me go through these 3 things. At Strong Towns, we have a saying: no neighborhood can be exempt from change, but no neighborhood should be subject to radical change. We have a grand bargain today, and it's kind of funny because I've heard the YIMBY movement voice this grand bargain, and it's one of the reasons why I love 95% of what the Yes in My Backyard groups do, but I can't be one of them because they have largely bought into this grand bargain, and I think it's a bad one. The grand bargain today is this. All of you can live in neighborhoods that don't change if we allow your neighborhood to experience intense radical change. Let me show you a picture of what this looks like. This is wrong in 2 accounts. First, the idea that your neighborhoods can experience no change is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how neighborhoods work. If you have a neighborhood, the idea that it can remain stagnant, let's go through this quickly in like a simple way. If we go out and build that new subdivision, and we build 40 homes, 100 homes, 200 homes, we build them all at once, it is the subdivision to be in. This is the new housing development. It's great. Everybody wants to live here. All the rich people move here, right? We all know this place. Everything looks nice. Everything looks good. What happens 25 years later? Everybody's roof needs to be fixed at the same time. Everybody's siding needs to be redone at the same time. Everybody's sidewalks crack at the same time. They were all built at the same time. They all have the same lifespan. They all fail at the same time. Everybody's appliances need to be fixed at the same time. Everything goes bad at the same time. And so neighborhoods go through this cycle where they are the place to be, and then when they get out a couple decades, 3 decades, you get instant decline. What happens to the affluent people who live in this neighborhood when they hit that decline? They decamp. They're like, ooh, this neighborhood is going downhill. I'm not sure I like the people here anymore. My neighbors they left for somewhere else. I think we're going to depart. And what happens is the neighborhood starts to financially cycle down. It starts to go to people of lesser financial means to now take care of a place that has far greater financial burdens. Historically, when you find yourself in a situation like that, what we see is that becomes a great investment vehicle. I'm going to buy that single family home. I'm going to convert it into a duplex. I'm going to raise its value. And then the neighborhood will continue to mature, expand, and grow over time. Sustain itself, maintain itself, reinvent itself. We lock them in regulatory amber. We say, like, you will never change ever. And so what happens is that neighborhoods today have a very clear cycle. They have a cycle of improvement, they have a cycle of decline and stagnation, and then they have a cycle of bottoming out. In the grand bargain that we have today, what you don't want to be is the prey to the predator. And so we have this debate like, oh, your neighborhood can be redeveloped, but not mine. Your neighborhood can be developed, but not mine. You try to be just not the neighborhood that gets picked on. The neighborhood that does get picked on then, what happens there? Well, all of a sudden, prices go sky high because now houses are not valued as houses, they're valued as investment properties. And when a house goes sky high, is anyone gonna put in granite countertops or paint that house or fix it? No, they become the home of speculators and slumlords, reinforcing the pattern. We grow our own NIMBYs. We grow our own people who don't want growth because this is how we do it today. The grand bargain of strong towns is that no neighborhood should experience radical change. No neighborhood should become unrecognizable. No neighborhood should be so radically transformed that the people who live there don't recognize it 5 years later. But in order to achieve that, every neighborhood has to allow a little bit of change. Every neighborhood has to allow that single-family home to put in that apartment in the spare bedroom. Every neighborhood needs to allow that starter home to go in between the two buildings. Every neighborhood needs to allow that backyard cottage. We have to have that level of growth allowed everywhere. That's the bargain. The standard that we set is that we need to make it really simple to build these units. Go ahead and keep your 2-year permitting process for the big 5/1. Go ahead and put that person that wants to build the new subdivision of homes through the process. I don't really care. But for people who want to come in and turn that bedroom into an apartment, people who want to come in and build that backyard cottage or build that starter home, if they walk in at 9 a.m., with a completed application, they should be able to walk up by noon and start building. That's what success looks like. That's what a frictionless permitting process looks like. And that's how easy we need to make it for people to be able to build these units. Just a last thing about parking. I don't know what your disposition is here about this. I know every city struggles with this to a degree. The way we build strong towns, the way we build great places is to not fill them full of parking. We are generally, let me put this in the room. We are generally very sensitive to the pain of not being able to find a place to park. We are generally insensitive to the pain of not being able to find a place to live. We need to switch those two sensitivities around. We need to become way more sensitive to the idea that people can't find a place to live, that they can afford, and we need to become a lot less sensitive to the idea that they can't find a place conveniently to park. And there is a direct relationship there. Okay, second thing, we need to create an ecosystem of incremental developers. We have a lot of developers who build stuff. We have very few developers who will do the kind of units that we need. This is often hard work. It often takes crazy people to do it. But the interesting thing is that we live with a lot of crazy people. I asked this question, who are the incremental developers? And the answer is that they're all over. They're everywhere. These are people who, a teacher who wants to take their summers and some of their weekends and work on a project. It's the person who has the house across the street that's in disrepair that they want to fix up. It's the person who feels underemployed at their job and has always wanted to be a developer and is willing to do this side project. There are all kinds of people who are ready to roll up their sleeves and do these things. Often what they lack is one set of skills and a bit of confidence. And I say one set of skills. To be an incremental developer, you have to know a lot of things. You have to know how to work with banks, how to put together pro formas, how to do financing. You have to understand how to get a permit, how to get through the regulatory process, how to talk to city officials. You've got to understand how to hire a subcontractor, what plumbing inspection looks like, how to work with an electrician, how to do roofing. You have to be a Renaissance person where you know a lot about a lot of things. This is really intimidating and really hard to do. especially for someone who's doing it as a side hustle. The way we close that gap is really simple. We get them together. We get people together who are interested in doing this work, and we just have them talk to each other. We just have them help each other. It is astounding what happens, and we outline in the book cities like South Bend, Indiana, where they have done this, where they've gotten people together to just chat. It's astounding how they solve each other's problems. Oh, you had trouble with a carpenter? Or you had trouble with someone laying carpet? I tell you what, I got a really good person over here to do that. Oh, you went to that bank and they said no? Oh, dude, I went to that bank too, they're horrible. You should be talking to this banker over here. Oh, you don't know how to do that? Let me help you out. Let me show you how I did this. These people are competitors to a degree, but they actually are building something in friendly competition that the bigger it gets, the better they all do. They are really competing against the big developers. And so there's a certain kind of friendship, camaraderie, we're in this together thing that develops when you start to get these people together and they start to do this kind of work. What we can do as cities, what we can do as towns, is actually start convening these people to do this. And let me do this. How many people in this room, have ever thought about the idea that I would like to be an incremental developer? There's a project I would like to do. There's a place I'd like to build something. There's a house I'd like to renovate. How many people in this room have actually pondered that? Okay. There's a lot of people here who are ready to do this work. We just have to activate them. We just have to get them together. There's groups like the Incremental Development Alliance that actually goes around and trains incremental developers. They hold conferences. They bring people together. They've got online training. If you want to get started in this, there's lots of ways to get going. Let's finish up by talking about finance then. I'm going to say this, and this is why I spent some time talking about the role of local government. Local governments have immense capacity to borrow money, far beyond what is sane, far beyond what is rational. Cities can literally bankrupt themselves with stupid borrowing. And here's the thing, most of them do, most of them are. Most of them borrow money for projects that lose money over and over and over again. We, if we're going to do this, have to do it in a way that is strategic, have to do it in a way that doesn't lose money. I've looked at some of your statewide housing initiatives, and they are the typical collection of how does government lose money in order to have slightly more housing. In my city, we are in the process of building an 80-unit apartment building, 12 of those units which will be quote-unquote affordable, below median household income affordable. 12 units. In order to do this, we are getting a federal housing grant, a state housing grant, regional assistance. We're giving them 20 years of tax increment financing. We're waiving all their sewer and water hookup fees, all of their building permit fees, and we are getting 12 units out of it, of affordable, 80 units total. We just did a housing study, and the housing study says, in order to meet the existing demand, we need 3,300 more units. Our approach does not scale. And let me actually say this as the insight. An approach where local government loses money doing this will never, ever scale. And so if we are going to be, in a sense, the bank for these entry-level units, we have to be the bank that makes money, or at least doesn't lose money, at least breaks even. Let me show you how we do this. There's a city in New York called Oswego. They are amazing. In Oswego, they have a neighborhood. There was a neighborhood in decline. And one of the things they recognized is that people in that neighborhood were pulling back. They looked around and they said, the city is disinvested here. People are disinvesting here. I like the neighborhood. I wish it were better. But I'm not going to paint my house. I'm not going to make big investments in my property because this neighborhood is in decline. What they did is they started a small grant program. They started a nonprofit. They would get these small grants, and they would go out and they would say, all right, if you do something that is recognizable from the street. If people can see what you've done from the street, we will pay for half of it. They had caps on all that. But here is the catch. You could only apply as a block. You had to have at least 70% of the properties on your block applying all at once. What they wanted to do is they wanted to create confidence in the neighborhood. And to do that, they had to create a wow effect for people. So if you lived in this neighborhood, you were going along, and then all of a sudden, this block, bam, in one summer, became really nice. Noticeably nicer. Then next summer, bam, this block and this block became really nice, noticeably nicer. Pretty soon, people in the neighborhood, recognizing that, hey, this neighborhood's going in the right direction, people started to take money out of their own pockets. They started to take their own time and energy, and they put into fixing up their own places without the grant. With something like $200,000 of grant money over a decade and a half, they have created $20 million of valuation. $20 million of valuation without economic displacement. That's wealth that has accrued to the people who were there, not people who got moved out to make way for more investment. In Muskegon, Michigan, they use tax increment financing to build starter homes. In general, tax increment financing is one of the most widely abused tools that cities have. The idea of tax increment financing is you're paying this much tax today, you go out and do something to improve the property and your value goes up, and now you're paying this much tax. That difference is the increment. If we take that increment and we apply it to a loan, we can finance a portion of the house or a portion of whatever we're constructing. What they have done in Muskegon is they've said, if you are building on a lot that has been empty for more than 2 decades, so this is not greenfield development, it's not any of that, it's a lot that has sewer and water and road, but for whatever reason hasn't been developed. If you're gonna build on that kind of a lot, and if you are gonna build a smaller starter home, so something less than 1,000 square feet, we're not subsidizing 2,000, 3,000 square foot homes. If you're gonna do that, we will give you a 15-year tax increment financing subsidy. We will take the taxes that you pay for the first 15 years, and we will apply that to a loan. The city actually goes out, takes on a loan, gives you that money as your down payment, and then the city takes your taxes and pays off that loan for the 15 years. If you leave the house early, before 15 years, you pay whatever is remaining. In California, we have seen such a robust market for building these backyard cottages that there's actually now financing that has grown up around it. If you go in most cities and say to the bank, I want to put in one of these backyard cottages, the best thing you can get is a home equity loan. For a lot of people who don't want to do a home equity loan, they paid off their mortgage, they did all that, the idea of a home equity loan is really not a good thing. For a lot of other people, they recognize that the interest rate on it is going to be much higher. Cities can borrow money at very, very low interest rates. And what we see is that cities can actually, in many ways, make these loans back. I'm going to talk about, let me do special assessments. You can actually do this here in this state as well. I looked, we can do these in Minnesota, but you can do them here too. We think of special assessments as being someone's going out and fixing your road or fixing your sewer pipe, and then you get an assessment that goes on your taxes. You pay it twice a year in addition to your property taxes. When it's paid off, the assessment goes away. Cities can use that same process to make housing improvements. If you want to put in that backyard cottage, if you want to finance that new apartment, the city can actually go out, borrow the money to do that, lend it, give it to you, lend it to you to make that improvement, and then collect it on your taxes. They can do that over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Here's the thing about this, and it's the same thing about using tax increment financing. In a normal loan situation, if you have a first mortgage and a second mortgage, if you default on your loan, the first mortgage gets paid off first, and if there's any money left over, the second mortgage will get that. If you are the city and you do a tax increment financing project or you do a special assessment, you jump ahead of the first loan. So you get paid off. If there's any kind of default, the city gets paid off before the first mortgage. In other words, this is the most secure type of loan that we can do. Very, very low risk, especially when we do them in places that have a high demand for this kind of housing. Finally, in Florida, we have seen places where cities actually have co-signed on loans. Cities and to a lesser degree, philanthropic organizations. These are places that prior to doing this were putting lots and lots of money into down payment assistance and housing subsidies here and housing subsidies there and losing lots of money doing it. They realize that they can make their dollars go much, much further if they just go in and co-sign on these entry-level products. You want to get a $20,000 loan to put in a backyard cottage? You want to get an $8,000 loan to put in this apartment in your fourth spare bedroom? We'll co-sign on that loan for you. And so they go to the bank and they say, all right, structure this loan how it makes sense for you. If you got to roll it over every 5 years or whatever it is, go ahead and structure it. But don't worry about default. We will back that loan. I have heard of 0 reports of there being any defaults on these. Here's the moral of the story. We have the capacity to fill that gap in financing where the macroeconomy, the financialized market, is not able to reach. We can fill that gap. We can do it at low risk, almost no risk to local governments. We can do it at scale, so we can repeat it over and over and over again. We can meet whatever demand there is for those loans. We can do. We have the capacity here to make that market happen. If we do this, if we make it easy to build these kind of houses, if we get people out building them, and if we support them with financial assistance, not at a loss, but at a break-even or slight profit for the community, so that we can do it over and over and over again, what we find is that we can build as many units as are needed and get a lot of people today who are struggling to get into housing into houses. Now, these might not be the place they want to be in. This might not be the place they want to end up in. But let's understand what we're doing. We're getting people into a house so they've got a shelter, they've got a place to live. And then they can start saving. Then they can start putting money away. Then they can start planning for when they want to make that leap up into that bigger house. And they can do it from a position of strength, not one of desperation. And if we do this right, not only can we do this in a way that helps people get into homes, but we can do it in a way that helps people who are already in homes. Because there's a lot of people who are house rich and cash poor. There's a lot of people who are backyard rich and cash poor, who when presented with this opportunity, if it were easy to build, easy to finance, would gladly take that up. It would solve a lot of their problems. And we all know people who are living alone in a place who would really, really benefit from someone who maybe would pay a little bit less rent to shovel the sidewalk for them in the winter, or mow the yard for them in the summer, or take them to the grocery store once a month, or be there in a medical emergency. These are, again, very moral transactions that used to happen all the time. They used to be a ubiquitous part of living in a community together. And we have largely taken them away from people. We can do this at scale. We can solve the housing crisis here in our city. We can escape this housing trap. All we have to do is think a little bit differently and have a little bit of courage to use some of these tools we have to do a lot of good. If you're interested, I see a few of you have the book. I'm happy to sign them afterwards. If you're interested, this is the book. I also want to say our website, strongtowns.org, we are doing a lot of this work. We started out as an advocacy organization using media. So you got us through a podcast. We do a lot of video work. We're on social media. We still write a lot of columns. Next year, starting in, I'm not going to promise, January, February, we have a series of 3 toolkits that are going to come out next year. The first one will be on housing regulatory reform. The second one will be on building an ecosystem of economic developers. And the third one will be on local finance. We are trying to attach, what I've found as I've traveled around is people are like, I'm really excited about this, but they want more help in getting started. So we are next year kind of trying to create that assistance. So we're going to put out these toolkits. We have people on staff that can help you, that can coach you through this stuff. If this is something that you want help with, is this something you want to look in deeper, go to our website, strongtowns.org. There's tons of resources there. They are all free to access and free to use. And if you're really, really interested in this, if you want to help us, Strong Towns is a nonprofit organization. We're a 501c3. If you go on next week, it's our member drive, so you're going to get inundated with asks. It's like, you go to church one time a year and they ask you for money. That's not what was going to happen here. But if you do go next week, we're going to ask you for money. But if you wait till the week after, we'll stop asking you for money and you can just get whatever you need to get going. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and chat with you all tonight. I can do that presentation in 45 minutes, but when everybody is smiling at me and so attentive and giving me all this visual feedback, I start to slow down and elaborate. So you got a longer version. I'm happy to, I know we've got time, I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about anything. This stuff, transportation, first book, anything you want to talk about, I'm happy to. So please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
So East Long Meadow is, I believe, at a crossroads. We're looking at a center town district development. We talked about 5 over 1s. I think East Long Meadow is more of a 2 over 1. Also, Massachusetts recently passed ADUs or backyard cottages. In February that'll be allowed in Massachusetts by right. Can you speak to the hesitation that folks might have for high-density housing developments that we might want to do? I have parents in town, I have young daughters in town, neither of which have a place to go when they want to downsize or move in East Long Meadow that's affordable, so 800 square foot. And I think there's a big hesitation to affordable housing, but if we can do market-based housing, high density, could you just speak to there's a lot of hesitation in this town about high-density housing and the ADUs.
Describe to me so I feel like I can talk about the ADUs all day. Yeah. Talk to me about because here's the thing about high density. What is high density for you? I grew up on a farm that was homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents. What is high density to my parents who live there is like having a neighbor that they can see. So this is a fungible term.
I think high density in East Long Meadow is 7 acres per unit, or per acre, 7 units per acre. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, in what context?
So we're looking at our downtown development.
Yeah.
I don't know if you came to the Rotary.
Yeah.
You came in. And so if you reach out and go down the corridors,
right.
In order to increase housing, we're running out of lots. We don't have many lots left in town, so we have to come up with something else. So in order to make
you have fewer untouched lots.
We have very few building lots.
Yeah.
So in order to create more housing, we have to do something different, which means we have to change zoning, which you spoke about.
Yep.
So that means high density, but there's a big hesitation, I believe, in this town to go affordable.
Right.
So in order to get housing that is reasonably priced, we need high density, right? Smaller high density housing.
I feel like that's where I'm getting stuck, because if you listen to me talk, and I know I'm supposed to repeat the questions, but we're kind of talking back and forth. So your question was on high density. If you go to the Strong Towns website, you follow the stuff we write or the stuff we talk about, we rarely use the word density. And if we do it with all kinds of pre-qualifiers. Because it is one of those things where I think people, if we did one of these exercises where I gave you all a piece of paper and I said, draw high density development, we would get 60 different examples and they would all be bad, right? They would be your version of hell, right? This is what high density looks like to me. At Strong Towns, we actually have an article. If you type Strong Towns density, you'll get an article called The Density Question that I wrote 8-9 years ago. And we talk about how density is a really bad metric to measure. planners are really good at planning for and delivering density. They're not really good at delivering places that people want to be. The places that people will pay the most to be in this country are generally the most dense places on the continent.
Excuse me, repeat that?
The places that have the most value in North America, the places that people will pay the most to be, the places in the highest demand are generally the places with the highest density. And so there's this very strange thing that we have where our conversation about adding units really is not correlated with density as much as it is with layout and design. We met first at Disneyland. If you go to Disney World in Orlando, Florida, what you have is the highest density environment most Americans will ever be in, connected with high-speed transit, where everybody walks everywhere once they get to where they're going. Part of the reason why I bring my team there is because I like to show them the design elements of this. Like, look how they handled this, look how they handled that. There's a lot of like subtle design things in these design of these parks. We really have no problem as Americans with density. What we tend to have a problem with is concentrated density and planners selling us density. And so I feel like when you're talking about your core downtown, the way that I would think about this and the way that I would talk about this is that we should think of every neighborhood as having a certain place in the development cycle. This is really my first book talks about this. Every city in human history prior to this post-war expansion started as a collection of little pop-up shacks, like literally like small little investments that people made. And as the city grew and matured, those little shacks, the land would become more valuable and the shacks would start to fall apart and you would get redevelopment and they would become 2- and 3-story buildings. And then eventually those would fall apart and they would become, more grand buildings, brick buildings, granite buildings. And eventually, you work all the way up to Manhattan, which literally started as little shacks and just kind of kept iterating in space. If we look at the neighborhoods around your downtown, the question we have to ask is, what phase are these in? Are they in an infant phase, a toddler phase, an adolescent phase, a preteen phase? What phase are they in? And then how do we get them to the next phase? What does that next level of maturity look like? And in every instance, it looks like adding more density, right? Looks like adding more units. But if we think of it as a density math problem, what we lose is we lose the building of a place. People will always reject density when it doesn't come with a place. If we build a place that people want to be, the density suddenly doesn't matter and really doesn't matter at all. And so I feel like there's this tension because you're asking me almost for like a number or a thing. And I don't have one, but I do think that part of the grand bargain of the Strong Towns approach is every neighborhood has to, in a sense, be open to that next level of maturity, that next level of density.
And I think that's our issue. We are mature along the Shaker Road corridor, the North Main corridor. And so without a zoning change, without this overlay district, we can't meet the new needs of the town, which is more housing. So I'm asking, what is that? What should that look like? What do we propose for that? For housing money?
I'm gonna. It depends on what is there. Okay. We're gonna do this really, really quick because this is a great question. So my hometown, 1870. My hometown, same exact street, 1905. This is a city that's growing incrementally up, incrementally out, and like thickening up over time, right? Another 30 years, you get this street here. It's the exact same street. This is like the next level of maturing. This right here is a little square in a city that you'll probably recognize here in a second. Here's 1911, here's 1918. That's Times Square. Yeah. So this idea of, and this is how I explained it to this way to an international, I had to give this presentation to an international group, and I was like, what will translate internationally? I did this. I'm like, this is Chloe Marohn. This is my oldest daughter. She started out like this, and then she went through this phase, and this phase, and this phase, this phase, and this phase. Each of these is Chloe, but each of these is like a different version of Chloe. When we think about our neighborhoods, when we think about the places that we're building, what we're really thinking about is what is the next version of the same place. Each of these versions of Chloe is beautiful and also maddening, right? When she's an infant, she's absolutely gorgeous, beautiful. I wish you'd never change, but you scream all night, you throw fits and tantrums, you poop your pants, I gotta change it, right? And then you become a teenager. And you're like, oh my gosh, you're driving me nuts, like you gotta move, like this is horrible. And then like, oh, I love this kid so much, right? Each phase has their good parts and their bad parts. The question that we don't ask ourselves, because we are used to cities being built now today all at once and having them be done, like stagnant. Like this neighborhood is done, it's all built. Well, no, it's not. What stage of its development is it in? So I feel like the answer to the question is, where are you in this maturity story? And how do you get to that next level? Like what is that? And in a lot of places, if you have, don't think of this like a planner because it can't be reduced to numbers. But if you try to look at numbers, if you have 5 units an acre, the next step is probably going to be something that's going to be 12, 15 units an acre. It's going to be a step like that, right? We have to think of cities as that way, as filling in. And what you're really doing, I feel like I'm getting into the first book, and there's a lot of like theory here that we could take hours to go into. What you are doing is you are raising the value of the land. Development in a city is about making the land more valuable. It's not about making the buildings on top more valuable. It's about making the land more valuable. Because the more we make the land go up in value, the more everything on it takes care of itself. If you have a building that's falling into disrepair, that's not being taken care of, but the land value is going up, that will be redeveloped. If you have a building that someone's living in and the land value is going up, they're going to have more equity to take care of their place. What we need to do is make this dynamic and have the land value go up. The way you make land values go up is to build great places. Places that are walkable, places that are accessible, places that are safe, places that people want to be in, places close to different commercial offerings. We thicken up and mature. That's way more complex. And I'm sorry that I don't have like a nice, easy answer to your question, but I feel like the answer is like way more complex. Please, someone else, go ahead.
So to kind of go off of what he asked. Only because,
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that's been brought up for the town is mixed-use space. And it kind of seems like going through your slides, obviously you see a more developed mixed-use space and a redevelopment of, say, commercial to commercial industry, commercial housing. So can you kind of just talk, like, I don't know if that's really a question, but can you kind of talk a little bit about the development of that? Or?
So I asked you not to use the term ADU, right? Accessory dwelling unit. I asked you also not to use the term tiny house. I feel like there's a whole category of planner terms that we have to somehow rid ourselves of. Mixed-use development is not a normal human term. There's nobody who understands that term outside of people who do planning and regulation, right? And one of the reasons why I'm trying to get you to change your language and change the way you talk about this is not just to be able to talk to people who are not, in a sense, converted about this. Like to make this work, we have to have hard conversations with people. In order to do that, we have to speak their language, not our language. But I also need us desperately to break out of the post-war top-down building paradigm. We're struggling because we have zoning codes that were designed to replicate a suburban pattern of development over and over and over, not mature places in place. We are struggling because we build the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, but we don't have a strategy to make better use of what we've built. That requires like a totally different language. So mixed use, to me, what you're talking about is how do we build neighborhoods? How do we build neighborhoods that actually reflect like what humans would do on a normal day? How do we build neighborhoods where I can go and get bread and milk? I could go to a clinic. My kid can walk to school. How do we build like a complete neighborhood? And not every neighborhood will have everything in it, but how do we allow the neighborhood the flexibility to adapt and change and meet the needs and demands of the people who are there? At the end of the day, that means a lot fewer restrictions on zoning. It means a lot fewer restrictions on buildings. It means having codes that get you to building buildings that are adaptable. Building things that can have multiple uses, that can change and shift over time depending on market demand and where you're at. It requires us to be a lot more flexible, a lot more dynamic, but I'm gonna use this caveat, and I try to get into this book. I hope I've got the credibility to say this. If we do that in a paradigm where we make large leaps, in other words, we've got single-story commercial or two-story commercial, and then next to it we're gonna get 6-story commercial. If we do it that way, you will get units quickly. You will get artificial mixed use quickly. But you will also stagnate everything around it because everything now will have to be a large leap. And you can only do large leaps so quickly. If you want to build neighborhoods, you actually have to throttle back the large leap and allow the development pressure and intensity to spread out incrementally over every neighborhood. And that does require a very mature community conversation.
Please. So just kind of to expound on this, New York City is not that city, it's 100 million neighborhoods.
New York City is the most dynamic city in the country. It is the most, I think, reflective of Strong Town's ideas and principles. But it is that way because it is all of these different places that are all maturing in like these really crazy ways. There's a, if you've ever studied like ecology or biology, we're all human. We all understand metabolism, right? An infant's metabolism is off the scale. An infant will go from 8 pounds to 16 pounds in like 2 days, right? It's insane how fast they grow. But your metabolism slows down as you get older. If you kept the rate of growth of an infant, we would all be 80 feet tall, right? It doesn't, you grow very quickly, but then you start to slow down. But you're still growing, and then you reach a certain point and you kind of reach this apex where like things are stable. It's the same thing with cities. When they're in that very infant phase, when they're in that very startup phase, they can grow very, very quickly in this incremental way. As they mature, each leap becomes harder to do. It takes more like metabolic energy to get to that next phase. What we have here, and I'm gonna acknowledge, I drove here largely in the dark. I've not spent a lot of time here. I spent a lot of time in the region. Most of the region is stuck at what would be a toddler phase. And our goal is not to skip over to an adult phase. Our goal is to actually say, how do we get this to an adolescent phase? How do we get this like whole place like going in that direction? You had something, please.
You mentioned something about a neighborhood. We've been in our neighborhood 60 years.
Yeah.
It was probably the finest street when we went there, along with a couple of others.
Yes.
And I've noticed that in the past 10 years, the older people that were there who kept their homes impeccable. Slowly now, there's maybe half of it the lawns maybe aren't quite, I mean, it's still a beautiful neighborhood, but
Yep.
you can see what you were talking about there.
Right. So you've seen some disinvestment and decline in your
Yes,
neighborhood.
and
Yes.
so how do you speak to your neighbors and everything, like, we should really, how do you get to that level? Now, you mentioned maybe having a meeting of everybody on the street and saying,
That would.
I applied for a grant to.
Yeah. How do we do that? I'm gonna. So the
My
question
wife
was.
said we had somebody on the street that lived,
Yeah.
and she would put a note in, your house needs painting.
Right.
In her mailbox.
That's so awesome.
And I'm telling you, that was incredible. That would really work,
Right.
That's not my comfort.
Right. Yeah, I got you. So the question is, and I've got to repeat so the camera gets it. We have a neighborhood that is a beautiful place, but decline has started to creep in places. What do we do? And it's as simple as having like a block conversation and all that. I'm gonna answer this in a way that is maybe going to be dissatisfactory, not very happy for you.
I'm 83, so my time is.
If we go back to the 1990 census, there was something like 300 census districts in the country that were in persistent poverty. These were places where, and I don't know the exact numbers, but like 30% or more of the population had been in poverty for more than a decade. So persistent poverty. Around 300. That number grew to 1,100 in the 2000 census. It grew to 3,300 in the 2010 census, and it grew to over 6,000 in the 2020 census. We have more neighborhoods, so geographically more space in persistent poverty. The reason we have that is because our development pattern, the way we build our cities, stagnates neighborhoods. And so when you don't allow a neighborhood to evolve and change, when there's no way for someone to invest in your neighborhood and bring the property up to a higher level of maturity, what happens is the neighborhood has two outcomes. There's three outcomes for any neighborhood. One is rebirth and renewal. That one's off the table. We eliminate that through zoning. We eliminate that through code regulations. Can't do it. If you're a single family neighborhood, you will forevermore be a single family neighborhood, right? Like it must be. Okay? So there's only two options left on the table. Stagnation, keeping where you're at forever, or decline. That's it. There's only two options left. You can stagnate it for a long time. And what your neighbor who is putting notes in people's doors and nudging people it is, and getting together people in a group, you can, in a sense, will your neighborhood to stagnate better than other neighborhoods. But the end result is decline. That's the only other option you have. And so part of why we see this growing trend of neighborhoods and persistent poverty is because we actually create them to decline. We actually build them in a way where decline is inevitable. And that's part of what we need to break out of. When I say we need to build the next increment of intensity everywhere, what I'm talking about is we actually need to get incremental investment in every neighborhood so that we get that third option back in place, renewal. If we don't have the ability to renew our neighborhoods, as wonderful as your neighborhood is, as nice as your street is, as good as your neighbors are, there's only one destination, and that's decline. And it makes me really sad. So my message to like the hardcore NIMBY, like we all know what NIMBY is, this not in my backyard. It's the people who kind of oppose any kind of development, what have you. My message to the NIMBYs are, if you are hoping for stagnation as your outcome, like I don't want anything to change, then you are embracing decline. Let's talk about what a slightly better version of your neighborhood looks like, and let's shoot for that. Please, go ahead.
So we're talking about having hard conversations. I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, which is it's the second largest city in New England by population.
Really?
No, nobody knows that.
I don't know that.
We're larger than Providence.
What town?
Worcester, Mass. And
And you are running the local conversation.
correct.
So we have groups that meet around the country, and you're one of them.
Yeah, I started it a little less than 2 years ago, and I was very, very surprised that there wasn't one already.
Yeah.
That's basically why I started it. And I've discovered since doing that people in Worcester do not talk about these things. And I think it's probably fundamentally because when you talk about the city government as being the highest order of organization, neighbors cooperating,
Yes.
I don't think the government of Worcester believes that that is the case.
Yes.
And I think that a big part of the reason that they don't is because neighbors don't, with some very, very wonderful exceptions, do not talk to each other in Worcester.
Yeah.
So how, I know people around the city who have our local conversation. We have people who care scattered throughout the city, but these neighborhood level conversations are not happening.
Right.
Like if I went and knocked on my neighbor's door,
Yeah.
I feel like the response would be confused or
Yeah,
hostile.
weirded out. Yeah.
I'm kind of lucky in that like my landlord is a person whose name and face I know.
Right.
But I know that's not the case for a lot of the neighborhoods, so there's a lot of like very real disconnection there.
Okay. So the question is about neighborhood communication, the fact that we don't really talk to each other much anymore. You've read Bowling Alone, the Robert Putnam book? You're familiar? I mean, this is a social phenomenon that's been documented. I'm going to give you the Strong Towns view of this. I've got an agreement with Wiley Publishing for 5 books. The 4th book I'm working on now is about economic development. But the 5th book is on the structure of local government. At the end of World War II, when we wanted cities to grow, the business model of the time was the military in World War II. All the business books, all the leading thoughts were if you're going to build a company and you want that company to be successful, you should copy our most successful institutions. We just won a global war. We had 4 branches of the military. They have silos and hierarchies. If you go look at General Motors, Ford, look at every big company back at that time, they all adopted that structure of government, or I'm sorry, that structure of hierarchy and organizational chart. Local government did the same thing. The way we would efficiently build this next version of America was by creating military structure within government. So we're not doing complex things anymore. We are building subdivisions. We need someone who can go out and build sewer and water systems. We need someone who can build road systems. We need someone to maintain parks. We need someone to do housing. We need someone to do zoning regulations. And so we create all of these specialties and all these departments, and we put them into silos. And then we energize those silos with top-down capital flow. If you go into any city hall, if you go into private business today, private businesses have largely moved out of this. Even auto manufacturers manufacture cars in teams now. The assembly line is way different than it would have been, 80 years ago, even 40 years ago. Google, as an example of the American corporation, is a team-based structure with a little bit of hierarchy. If you go into local government today, even in small places, we are organized vertically in silos. And with that vertical orientation, we are very sensitive to cash flow into the community. So local governments are generally obsessed with what is the money we can get from Washington, D.C., what is the money we can get from the state capitol, what is the money we can get from Wall Street with investment dollars coming into our community. And so you have people who are full-time grant writers, people whose expertise is in this program or that program. We're very, very sensitive to the vertical flow of money. What we argue is that government needs to actually shift and become very sensitive to what is going on in our neighborhoods. We talk about understanding the struggles of people in a place. How do people struggle to use the place as we have built it? if you watch local government, you will see that the major initiatives all kind of associate with some capital flow. In my city, the last 2 years, the big obsession has been a children's museum. We need to build a children's museum. Oh, we've got kids who are making a mess in the park. Oh, if we just had a children's museum. Oh, we've got moms that are struggling. We've got kids who are showing up to school not able to read. Well, we need a children's museum. Oh, we've got homeless people. Oh, if we just had a children's museum. Everything's a children's museum. And I'm like, why the hell do everybody keep talking about a children's museum? And then I found out, guess what? There's a state program to fund the study of where to put a children's museum. And if you agree on where and you pitch in 20%, 30%, the state has money to actually build the children's museum. And so all of a sudden now, all the advocacy in City Hall is around building a children's museum. There's a concept called subsidiarity, and it comes from the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic. I'm not trying to make you all Catholic here, but I do think there's something to be learned from it that can really help us from a civic standpoint.
There's almost a reverse subsidiarity.
There's a reverse subsidiarity going on right now.
And
Yes.
And what's
Yes.
very specifically, that's the city council,
Yes.
the city manager, whom they send recommendations, and they debate things endlessly and then put it in the silo.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what always happens.
Subsidiarity is two ideas paired, and we usually get one but not the other. I want to pair these two ideas. Subsidiarity is the lowest level of decision making that can competently make the decision, needs to make the decision. If you and I are neighbors and we have something that we have to figure out, we have to figure it out. We can't give that to the neighborhood or the city or someone else to figure out. We need to figure it out because that's the level that it needs to happen at. The role then, this is the second part of it, the role of the next higher level is not to intervene, not to arbitrate, not to make the decision. The role of the next level is to facilitate the conversation, to lend assistance. You and I are squabbling. We don't want Solomon to come in and split the baby, right? We want you to come in and basically make us work it out, because that's the way decisions need to happen. Jane Jacobs calls cities co-creations, things we build together. We have made cities things that we pay our taxes to, that then we expect the delivery of services. I pay my taxes, fix my road. I pay my taxes, maintain my sidewalk. I pay my taxes, why is this park in disrepair? And we have separated ourselves from the delivery of those services, and we've separated ourselves from the co-creation that we all have together. I feel like this is deeply pernicious. And I feel like if we're going to fix this, ideally it would be local governments who lead this effort. But in the absence of that, this is why we have a local conversations program. It is to start this dialogue within our communities, because there's 3 power centers in every city making decisions about how we build, how we invest. The 3 power centers are elected officials, technical staff, the people who advise them, and then the general public. In order to make change in any city, you have to have 2 of those 3 aligned for change. If the general public wants to change and the elected officials want to change, they'll fix the staff. If the staff wants to change and the elected officials want to change, they'll sell it to the public. If the public wants to change and the staff wants to change, they'll elect new people. We got to have 2 of the 3. It sounds like in your city, you have half of one.
We actually have very rigorous staff.
Okay.
Very handicapped by the government.
Then to me, the strategy is, the one you can control, is how do we change the conversation in our community to be that second power center? And that seems unsexy, that seems unglorious, right? Like you would love to just say, here's how we do it, and have everybody like, yes. It actually takes a lot of meeting with people, talking to people, collecting people, a lot of listening and listening and listening, a lot of kindness, a lot of just, endless kind of, I hear your concern, I hear your concern. Have you thought about this? It's hard work. I mean, really do. our local conversations are doing heroes work. We have 250 of them now around the country, and they're doing amazing, amazing work. We're trying, the only thing I will tell you is that we are always trying to get more resources and assistance and help to you, because you're doing the hardest job there is. And what you're doing is you're prepping the ground for that Jane Jacobs vision of getting back to co-creating places. Because if we don't do that, if local government remains the thing that we outsource the future of our community to, today they don't respond to us. They respond to other masters. We need to reorient them to respond to us, and we need to be ready to work with them. And if we can get to that, we can do some amazing things. But if we can't get to that, we have the people designed to serve us who will never serve us. And quite frankly, we're not ready to have that relationship either. So it's a two-way thing. I've kept you here longer than we said we would. How about we do one more question? You had your hand up, and I don't want to ignore you. How about we do one more question, and then if anybody wants a book signed or to chat, I'm going to sit down over here, and I'll be happy to sign, and then you can have the rest of your evening to do whatever you do in this part of the country in the evening. You've all been delightful. Please, you get the last question. Don't make it about density.
Don't make it about this change happening organically from the grassroots, basically, local government. And I read both your books.
Thank you.
Like, very interesting. I'd like to have you sign it afterwards. I'm involved in government and council, city council level, and I know that there's a complete streets program that really is top down, and that's coming from the federal government and the state government. But it does kind of dovetail with your plan and your vision for a walkable city, the 15-minute city, and you're talking about organically developing, a model of free state and housing crap. Just trying to envision in my mind how that would be retrofitted into neighborhoods that we're familiar with in suburbia. They're lovely. I mean, Long Meadow, lovely neighborhood particularly. But and maybe your answer is that it's got to happen organically, and it's up to the community to decide. But I think you need a grand design, and maybe there are some. You spoke about sort of European towns and cities that are way ahead of us, maybe in this in doing this, and that maybe is there a model or models that we could look at that we could develop kind of a master plan, or maybe these various communities could say, well, listen, we live in Long Meadow or we live in Chicopee, we're very different, but maybe this is like a design that we could look at, for the future that we could all kind of agree on, so that we're not, kind of retrofitting something that's going to be hodgepodge and make a lovely community into, a monstrous, ugly location. You know what I mean? So
Yeah. I don't know if I can repeat that question. No, I'm with you. I'm.
But I'm thinking of the top down and
Yeah.
the organic, like east meets west. And what
Yeah. So you brought up a lot of things, and I'm struggling because I feel where you're going, and I feel like you're asking the right questions. I feel like you're struggling with the right things. Let me make two comments that might be jarring, but I think actually might help you get to the next set of thoughts that will help you answer this. The first one, and this is the end of chapter 3 in Strong Towns, the first book, I talk about Detroit. And I make the case that Detroit is not some weird, crazy anomaly. It's not a place different than us. If you go to Detroit, you see widespread decline. You see neighborhoods abandoned. You see home sites abandoned. And our reaction to that is, well, that will never happen here. That's not our future. That's Detroit. They're different. And I'm going to tell you, depending on where you go in the country, they all have a different explanation of what happened in Detroit, right? Culturally, we look at Detroit and we say, well, That's what happens when you have auto manufacturers, or that's what happens when you have big government, or that's what happens when you get white flight, or that's what happens. We all have our own narrative, but the narrative is we're not Detroit, they're different. I make the argument in the book that we are all Detroit, and that the difference between Detroit and us is that they got started sooner. We are on the path to insolvency behind them, but we're a couple decades behind. And we've generally, in some places like this, had more affluence floating around to kind of bail us out on the margins. I feel like when we look at our neighborhoods and we say, this is a very pleasant place, this is a nice new suburb, this is a nice, that we are very much like the people of Detroit in the early 1900s who said, look we have the wealthiest city in the world. We have, one of the wealthiest places. Detroit was like probably the wealthiest city in North America, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. If you go to Detroit today and go look at some of the old buildings, like their opera house, it'll blow your mind. Blow your mind. I mean, one of the most grand buildings I've ever been in. Massive chandeliers, 5 stories or 5 decks of thing. It will blow your mind. These people were so wealthy. They spent that wealth building a development pattern that basically denuded and spread out that wealth over this massive area, driving up their costs and creating their insolvency. I feel like the question of what do we do with these places? How do we do this organically? I feel like part of it is coming to grips with the idea that some of these places actually won't be saved. Some of these places will actually be abandoned. And that seems insane to us today. That seems crazy. How could that possibly happen? I guarantee you that in places where this has happened, they said that same thing a generation before it did. At some point, these become bad investments and people move away from them. Now, the question I think we struggle with is, okay, we've got all this. We have this covenant with people that we will maintain it. We will take care of it. That obligation is this much money. We only have this much money. How do we come to grips with the fact that we won't maintain all of it or that we can't meet this covenant? What do we do in these neighborhoods? And this is where I feel like that word organic is more powerful to me than mixed use, complete streets, or any of the other, those words that you used. I think we need to have systems that allow people to figure it out. Part of co-creation is giving people the ability to react to stress and opportunity in their neighborhood. And this is where I think our desire for orderliness becomes a big handicap for us. There's a saying in Silicon Valley that innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb. And innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. Because we are affluent, we have very low tolerance for chaos. We have very low tolerance for messiness. But understand the trade-off there. Without a little bit of messiness, we are embracing dumb. Without a little bit of chaos around the edges, we are asking for order, and then we will get dumb levels of innovation. And so instead of a master plan, instead of a kind of grand vision of this is how this neighborhood will be and this is how this neighborhood would be, I think what we need to adopt is more of a gardener mentality. Anyone who gardens knows that you don't control what grows. You only control what happens after it grows, right? We plant seeds, we get things going, and then it starts to mature. And we can trim a little bit here and pull some weeds here and put a little trellis here, but ultimately the garden will grow itself. When we look at the city as a garden, it changes our perspective, and we go from being, hey, here's my plan for what will be here and here and here and how it will develop, to I am the master gardener who actually is out here nurturing this to the next step and the next step and the next step. And ooh, it needs a little bit of water. It needs a little bit of fertilizer. It needs, hopefully the sun shines today, that type of thing. That is more chaotic. That is messier. But it also allows the co-creation that we need that will actually solve these problems. I know that is a little bit scary because we are comfortable asking local government to solve these problems for us. We are comfortable, in a sense, believing that we can just outsource it to smart, dedicated people who will run for office. And I'm here to fix this and make this decision. It's much harder to call on ourselves and our neighbors to work together and figure this out. I'm not saying that we devolve everything to chaos, but I am saying that if we give each neighborhood the opportunity to put in that corner store, put in that backyard cottage, convert their house into a duplex if they want, make that little change. What we see is that people will take that initiative and our neighborhoods will start to evolve again. And then we garden. That's the only path out. And it's the only path with the level of resources we have as well. We can't continue to do what we've done. We have to actually make better use of what we have. And that means we got to think like gardeners. We really do. You guys have been just delightful. Really, really wonderful. Thank you for being here. You're all very engaged, and I feel like we could do this for a long, long time. So,
You have books for sale here?
I don't have any books, but you can get them at your local bookstore or anywhere.